There are moments in life when the ground beneath your feet simply ceases to exist, when everything you believed about yourself, about your history, about the very foundation of your existence, crumbles away like autumn leaves touched by frost. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 3 weeks after I buried the only parents I had ever known. The Ashford house had always been a monument to another era, a Victorian mansion that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with its dark wood paneling and heavy draperies that had not been changed in decades. The smell of old wood polish and something else, something indefinable and unsettling, permeated every room. After Margaret and Theodore Ashford passed within months of each other, the house fell to me, their adopted son, along with the considerable task of sorting through a lifetime's accumulation of possessions. I had been methodically working through the estate for weeks, room by room, drawer by drawer. The process felt archaeological in nature, each layer revealing another decade of careful preservation, of things saved for reasons that died with their owners. The house seemed to watch me as I worked, its windows like eyes that had seen too much, its floorboards creaking conversations from decades past. It was in the study, behind a false back in Theodore's mahogany desk, that I found the first photograph. The girl in the image could not have been more than 10 years old. She stood in what I recognized as the mansion's front garden, though the landscaping was different, wilder, more overgrown. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that suggested the photograph had been taken sometime in the 1970s, judging by the faded quality and the particular grain of the print. But it was her face that stopped my heart entirely. She looked exactly like me, not similar, not reminiscent. Exactly like me. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same slight asymmetry to the mouth that I had always attributed to a childhood accident. Even accounting for the differences between male and female features, the resemblance was so profound it felt like looking into a mirror held by time itself. My hands trembled as I turned the photograph over. Written in faded pencil, in Theodore's careful script, were 2 words: Elena, 1974. I had never heard the name Elena mentioned in the Ashford house. In 32 years of life, through countless family dinners and bedtime stories and quiet conversations, no Elena had ever been part of our family narrative. Yet here she was, standing in our garden, looking like she belonged there. Looking like she belonged to me or I to her. The rational mind seeks explanations for the impossible. Perhaps she was a distant relative, a cousin I had never met. Perhaps the resemblance was coincidental, a trick of light and shadow in the peculiar way memory distorts perception. But as I sat there in the gathering twilight, with only the desk lamp casting its circle of yellow light in the increasingly dark study, I felt the first stirrings of something far more unsettling than confusion. I felt recognition. Not of the girl herself, but of something else, a presence that seemed to permeate the house, particularly in certain rooms at certain times of day. A sense of being watched, of spaces that held their breath when you entered them. I had always attributed these sensations to the natural atmosphere of an old house, to the way Victorian architecture seemed designed to harbor shadows and secrets. Now, staring at Elena's photograph, I began to wonder if those sensations had been trying to tell me something I was not ready to hear. The discovery of that first photograph changed the quality of silence in the house. Where before the quiet had been merely the absence of sound, now it felt heavy with unspoken questions. Who was Elena? Why had her existence been hidden from me? And most disturbing of all, if the Ashfords had kept one child's secret, what other secrets lay buried in the accumulated decades of their careful, respectable lives? As I prepared to leave the study that evening, I made a decision that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, my identity, and the house that had shaped my entire understanding of home. I would search every room, examine every document, investigate every shadow until I found the truth about Elena and her connection to the Ashfords. I could not have imagined in that moment how desperately I would come to wish I had simply burned that photograph and walked away. The Victorian mansion revealed its secrets reluctantly, like a witness under gentle but persistent interrogation. Each room held its own particular atmosphere, its own collection of shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The house had been built in 1887 by Theodore's grandfather, constructed during an era when privacy was paramount and houses were designed with hidden spaces for storing more than just valuables. I began my systematic search the morning after finding Elena's photograph, starting with the second floor where my childhood bedroom had been. The hallway stretched before me, lined with portraits of Ashford ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow movement with the particular malevolence that Victorian portraiture seemed to specialize in. The runner carpet, a deep burgundy that had faded to the color of dried blood, muffled my footsteps, but could not silence the way the old floorboards announced my presence with their familiar chorus of creaks and sighs. Margaret's sewing room yielded the first cache of hidden materials, behind a panel in the antique armoire, a panel I discovered only because the wood had warped slightly, creating a gap that caught the morning light. I found a manila envelope containing 12 more photographs of Elena, spanning what appeared to be several years of her life. The progression was disturbing in ways that took time to fully comprehend. In the earliest images, Elena appeared perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in various locations throughout the house and grounds. She seemed happy enough, though there was something in her posture, a slight stiffness, a way of holding herself that suggested she was posing rather than being captured in natural moments. As the photographs progressed chronologically, subtle changes became apparent. The smiles grew more forced. Her eyes developed a wariness that had not been present in the earlier images. By the final photograph in the sequence, Elena appeared to be around 12, and the light had gone out of her face entirely. What made these discoveries particularly unsettling was their deliberate concealment. These were not family photos mistakenly forgotten in old albums. They had been carefully hidden, preserved with the attention one might give to evidence rather than memories. Each photograph was protected by tissue paper stored in chronological order, labeled in the same careful script I had found on the first image. The pattern of concealment extended throughout the house. Theodore's study revealed a false bottom in the filing cabinet, containing manila folders with cryptic labels, arrangements 1962-1975, correspondence, private, the registry. But the folders themselves were empty, their contents apparent. Removed and relocated or destroyed. In Margaret's bedroom, I discovered that the window seat was not merely decorative but concealed a storage compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were items that seemed to belong to children. A small pearl necklace, a diary with a tiny lock, several pieces of delicate jewelry that would have fit a girl of perhaps 10 or 11 years old. None of these items had belonged to me. I would have remembered such distinctive pieces, and their presence raised questions about how many other children might have passed through the Ashford household without leaving any trace in the official family narrative. The basement proved to be the most revealing and disturbing space in my investigation. The stairs descended into a coolness that seemed to emanate not just from the stone foundation, but from something deeper and more persistent. The main basement area was finished in the style of the 1950s, with wood paneling and linoleum flooring that had yellowed with age. But it was behind the furnace, in a space I had never explored as a child, that I made the discovery that would fundamentally alter my understanding of the house's history. A section of the stone foundation wall was not original construction. The mortar was a slightly different color. The stones fitted with less precision than the Victorian-era masonry that comprised the rest of the basement. When I pressed against this section, it shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing that it was not a solid wall, but a carefully constructed false front. Behind this barrier lay a room that should not have existed. The space was perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling so low I had to duck to avoid the exposed beams. The air was stale and carried an odor that spoke of decades of confinement, not the clean mustiness of typical basement storage, but something more organic and disturbing. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, its filament blackened with age but still functional when I found the switch. The room contained evidence of long-term habitation, a narrow bed with a mattress that bore the impressions of use, a small wooden chair, a chamber pot that had been emptied but never properly cleaned. On the walls, scratched into the stone with what appeared to be a nail or similar implement, were marks that took several minutes to decipher. Some were simple hash marks, possibly counting days. Others were words, carved with the desperate persistence of someone with unlimited time and urgent need to leave a record. Among the legible inscriptions, one name appeared repeatedly: Elena. Standing in that hidden room, surrounded by evidence of imprisonment and desperation, I began to understand that my discovery of Elena's photographs was not the beginning of a mystery, but the end of one. This room had been someone's world, someone's prison, someone's final residence before... what? The scratches on the walls suggested months, possibly years of confinement. The personal items upstairs suggested multiple children over multiple decades, and the careful documentation, the hidden photographs, the systematic concealment of evidence suggested something far more organized and deliberate than I was prepared to contemplate. As I climbed the stairs from the basement that evening, I carried with me the absolute certainty that the house I had called home for 3 decades had been the site of horrors that had been carefully hidden, systematically covered up, and passed down through generations of Ashfords like a terrible inheritance. The investigation that had begun with a single photograph of a girl who looked like me had revealed that I was not the first child to call the Ashford mansion home, and that my survival to adulthood might be the exception rather than the rule. The pursuit of documentary evidence required leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion and venturing into the sterile fluorescent lighting of municipal buildings and archival facilities. Armed with the dates from Elena's photographs and the cryptic references I had found among the hidden materials, I began the methodical work of tracing official records, birth certificates, adoption papers, school enrollment documents, and the 1,000 small bureaucratic traces that modern life leaves behind. The Cumberland County Courthouse proved to be my first stop, its neoclassical facade a stark contrast to the Gothic sensibilities of the Ashford mansion. The clerk in the records office, a woman whose efficiency was matched only by her indifference to my increasingly desperate questions, helped me navigate the labyrinthine filing systems that documented decades of legal proceedings. The Ashford family's official records painted a picture of respectability and civic engagement. Theodore had served on various municipal committees, Margaret had been active in several charitable organizations, and their financial records suggested a family of comfortable means with no apparent irregularities. But it was in the adoption records that the first significant gaps began to appear. My own adoption, finalized in 1992 when I was 6 months old, was documented through a private agency called Sanctuary Family Services. The paperwork was minimal. Unusually so, according to the clerk, who noted that most adoptions from that era included far more extensive documentation of the birth parents' circumstances and the evaluation process for adoptive families. My file contained only the bare minimum required by law: medical records indicating a healthy infant, a brief psychological evaluation of the Ashfords, and a single page regarding my biological parents that had been so heavily redacted it conveyed no meaningful information. But Sanctuary Family Services had handled more than just my adoption. Searching through the records chronologically, I discovered references to at least 6 other children placed with the Ashfords between 1962 and 1985. All girls, all between the ages of 6 and 8 at the time of placement, all processed through the same private agency that had arranged my own adoption. The pattern was disturbing enough in itself, but what made it truly unsettling was the absence of any subsequent documentation. Typical adoption records include periodic checkups, school enrollment confirmations, and various administrative details that accumulate over years of a child's development. For these 6 girls, the paper trail ended abruptly shortly after their placement with the Ashfords. A visit to the county health department revealed additional irregularities. While death certificates are matters of public record, I could find no evidence that any of these children had died in Cumberland County. Similarly, school enrollment records showed initial registration for several of the girls, but no indication of completed academic years or transfers to other districts. The most disturbing discovery came at the Cumberland County Cemetery, where generations of Ashfords had been interred in a family plot that occupied a prominent position on the grounds. The plot contained headstones for Theodore and Margaret, their parents and grandparents, and various relatives spanning back to the mid-19th century. But tucked away in the far corner of the family section, almost hidden by an overgrown yew tree, were 6 small markers bearing only first names and dates. Sarah, 1965, Jennifer, 1968, Patricia, 1971, Elena, 1974, Michelle, 1978, Rebecca, 1982. The dates aligned perfectly with the adoption records I had discovered. Each marker was simple granite, bearing only the name and year. No birth dates, no family names, no indication of their connection to the Ashfords. They appeared to be the graves of children, marking lives that had been deliberately obscured from official documentation. Standing among those small headstones, I felt the full weight of what I was uncovering. These were not random coincidences or bureaucratic oversights. This was evidence of a systematic pattern spanning decades, involving the placement of vulnerable children with the Ashfords and their subsequent disappearance from all official records. The hidden room in the basement, the photographs carefully preserved in secret locations, the personal belongings stored like trophies, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than irregular adoption procedures. My research expanded to newspaper archives, where I discovered that missing children reports from surrounding counties showed a disturbing correlation with the dates I had identified. Between 1962 and 1985, 17 children had disappeared from towns within a 50-mile radius of the Ashford mansion. Not all disappeared during periods when the Ashfords were known to have taken in children, but enough did to suggest more than coincidental timing. The newspaper coverage of these disappearances followed a predictable pattern. Initial reports were comprehensive, featuring school photographs and desperate pleas from parents. Follow-up coverage diminished rapidly, and within weeks or months, the stories disappeared from the local press entirely. Several of the missing children matched the general descriptions of those the Ashfords had officially adopted. Young girls, often from troubled family situations, frequently without extensive support networks that might pursue investigations aggressively. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came in the form of a single newspaper clipping, found tucked inside a library book on Victorian architecture. The clipping, from the Cumberland County Herald dated September 15, 1974, reported the disappearance of Elena Castellanos, age 11, from a foster home approximately 30 miles from the Ashford mansion. The accompanying photograph showed the same face I had found hidden in Theodore's desk, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same expression of barely contained wariness. According to the article, Elena had been placed in foster care after her mother's death and her father's incarceration for drug-related offenses. She had been living with the Turner family for approximately 6 months when she disappeared from their home during the night, taking only the clothes she wore and leaving no indication of her intentions or destination. The case had been investigated by local authorities, but with limited resources and no evidence of foul play, it had eventually been relegated to inactive status. The article concluded with a quote from Elena's foster mother. "She was such a sweet child, but she carried a lot of pain. She talked sometimes about finding a real family, people who would love her properly. I pray she found what she was looking for." Reading those words, I understood that Elena had not found what she was looking for. She had found the Ashfords instead, and whatever happened to her in the hidden room beneath their mansion had ended with a simple granite marker bearing only her first name and the year of her death. As I left the library that evening, carrying photocopies of everything I had discovered, I faced the terrible certainty that I was not investigating a historical mystery, but documenting evidence of serial crimes that had been perpetrated over decades with apparent impunity. The Ashfords had not been simply adoptive parents with unconventional methods. They had been predators who used the adoption system to acquire vulnerable children for purposes I was only beginning to understand. The question that haunted me as I drove back to the mansion was not what had happened to Elena and the others. The evidence was painting an increasingly clear picture of their fate. The question was why I had survived when they had not, and whether my survival had been accidental or part of some larger design that I was not yet prepared to comprehend. The hidden room behind the furnace had revealed its secrets reluctantly, but it was the discovery of the second concealed space that truly unveiled the systematic nature of the Ashfords' activities. This space, accessible through a section of the basement wall that had been designed to pivot on hidden hinges, contained the administrative heart of what could only be described as a decades-long operation. The room was larger than the first, perhaps 15 feet square, and had been converted into what appeared to be a combination office and storage facility. Unlike the sparse prison-like conditions of the other hidden space, this room had been furnished with care and attention to detail. A heavy oak desk dominated one corner, flanked by filing cabinets that bore the patina of decades of use. The walls were lined with shelves containing hundreds of documents, photographs, and personal items that had been organized with the obsessive precision of a dedicated archivist. The centerpiece of this collection was a leather-bound ledger, easily 18 inches tall and bound in what appeared to be hand-tooled leather of exceptional quality. The ledger's pages, filled with Theodore's meticulous handwriting, documented what he referred to as the arrangement, a systematic process that had been refined over decades of practice. Each entry in the ledger corresponded to one of the children whose photographs I had discovered. The entries were comprehensive, beginning with detailed biographical information, family background, psychological profiles, physical descriptions, and assessments of what Theodore termed suitability factors. The level of detail was extraordinary, suggesting that the selection of these children had been based on extensive research and careful evaluation, rather than random opportunity. Sarah Morrison, age 7, had been the first, acquired in 1965 through what the ledger described as standard placement procedures. The entry noted her parents' death in an automobile accident, her placement in temporary foster care, and her subsequent integration into the household arrangement. The documentation that followed tracked her progress through various stages of what Theodore referred to as preparation and conditioning. The clinical language could not disguise the horror of what was being described. Each child had been subjected to a systematic process of isolation, psychological manipulation, and what the ledger euphemistically termed behavioral modification. The entries detailed dietary restrictions, sleep deprivation, and various forms of punishment designed to break down resistance and ensure compliance with the Ashfords' demands. But it was the final section of each entry that revealed the true purpose of this elaborate process. Theodore's notes indicated that each child was being prepared for what he called the culmination, a ceremony that appeared to combine elements of ritualistic practice with Theodore's own twisted psychological theories about dominance and submission. The children were not being abused randomly. They were being systematically prepared for sacrifice in rituals that Theodore believed would ensure the Ashford family's continued prosperity and power. Elena's entry was the most detailed of all, spanning nearly 20 pages of Theodore's careful script. She had been acquired in September 1974, shortly after her disappearance from the Turner foster home. The ledger revealed that her selection had not been random. Theodore had been monitoring foster placements throughout the region, identifying children who met his specific criteria, girls between the ages of 7 and 12, without strong family connections, with histories of trauma that had made them distrustful of authority figures. The documentation of Elena's time in the Ashford household made for deeply disturbing reading. She had initially resisted the conditioning process, displaying what Theodore noted as exceptional strength of will and persistent defiance. Her confinement in the hidden room had lasted nearly 3 years, during which she had been subjected to increasingly severe psychological and physical abuse designed to break her resistance. The ledger entries tracked her gradual deterioration with the same clinical precision that a scientist might use to document a laboratory experiment. Theodore noted changes in her behavior, her physical condition, and her psychological state with the detached interest of someone conducting research rather than someone interacting with a human child. The entries revealed Tom's. Elena had been forced to participate in preliminary rituals, had been photographed extensively as part of what Theodore called documentation requirements, and had ultimately been prepared for final culmination in the winter of 1977. The final entry regarding Elena was dated February 14, 1978. It consisted of a single line: arrangement completed, materials archived, preparation for next acquisition to commence. But the ledger revealed that I had not been Theodore's next acquisition. The entries continued chronologically, documenting the selection and processing of Michelle in 1978 and Rebecca in 1982. My own entry did not appear until 1992. And when it did, it was markedly different from all the others. Unlike the detailed biographical profiles that preceded each previous acquisition, my entry began with a single notation: special circumstances, alternative approach required. The subsequent documentation revealed that my selection had not followed the established pattern. Rather than being acquired through foster placement systems, I had been obtained as an infant through what the ledger described as private arrangement with cooperating parties. More significantly, my entry indicated that I was to be raised as a son rather than prepared for the same fate as the others. Theodore's notes suggested that this deviation from his established pattern was necessary because the arrangement requires continuation across generations and that the bloodline must be preserved to maintain potency of the culmination ceremonies. The horrifying implication was clear. I had been acquired not as another victim, but as the next generation of perpetrators. Theodore had intended to raise me as his successor, to eventually inherit not just the Ashford property, but the systematic abuse of children that he had refined over decades. My survival had not been accidental. It had been essential to the continuation of his work. The ledger contained additional evidence that supported this theory. References to the bloodline and hereditary obligations suggested that Theodore believed his activities were part of a family tradition that stretched back generations. There were cryptic references to his own father and grandfather, implications that the Ashford family's apparent prosperity had been built upon systematic ritual abuse spanning more than a century. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery in the ledger was evidence that Theodore had not been working alone. The final sections contained correspondence with individuals identified only by initials, suggesting a network of like-minded people who shared Theodore's beliefs and participated in what he called complementary arrangements. These letters discussed the exchange of children between households, coordination of ceremonies, and mutual support for maintaining secrecy about their activities. One letter, dated 1981, discussed what the writer referred to as the regional network, and mentioned 17 active households participating in coordinated activities. The letter concluded with a reference to the upcoming gathering and instructions for bringing fresh materials for evaluation by the council. Standing in that hidden room, surrounded by decades of documented horror, I began to understand that the Ashford mansion had been merely one component of a much larger operation. Theodore and Margaret had not been isolated predators, but active participants in an organized network that had been systematically abusing and murdering children across multiple states for generations. The revelation that I had been intended as Theodore's successor rather than his victim added another layer of horror to the discovery. My entire childhood, the love and attention I had received from the Ashfords, had been grooming for a role I could never have imagined. Every bedtime story, every family dinner, every expression of affection had been designed to prepare me to become the next generation of systematic child abusers. As I closed the ledger and prepared to leave that terrible room, I carried with me the knowledge that my survival had come at the cost of Elena's life and the lives of all the others whose names were carved into the stone walls above. I had been spared not through luck or divine intervention, but because I had been selected to carry on a legacy of horror that had been carefully preserved and passed down through generations of Ashfords. The question that remained was what I would do with this knowledge, and whether the network that had supported Theodore's activities was still active, still acquiring children, still conducting their ritualistic ceremonies in hidden rooms beneath respectable facades. The correspondence found in the ledger provided names and locations that expanded my investigation far beyond the Ashford mansion. Using the careful filing system Theodore had maintained, I began to trace connections that revealed a network of unprecedented scope and organization. What had begun as an investigation into one family's secrets had uncovered evidence of a coordinated conspiracy that spanned multiple states and appeared to have operated with impunity for decades. The letters, written in code that was relatively simple to decipher once the pattern became apparent, revealed regular communication between Theodore and at least 23 other individuals. These correspondents were identified by initials and numerical designations, but cross-referencing with postmarks and return addresses gradually revealed their actual identities. They were doctors, lawyers, business owners, and other members of respectable society who had used their positions and resources to facilitate the acquisition and abuse of vulnerable children. Dr. Marcus Whitmore, identified in the correspondence as MW7, operated a private practice in child psychology in a neighboring state. His letters to Theodore discussed methods for identifying suitable candidates among his young patients, particularly those from broken homes or with histories of trauma that made them unlikely to be believed if they reported abuse. Dr. Whitmore had apparently referred at least 6 children to Theodore over a 15-year period, children who had subsequently disappeared from his practice records and were never reported missing by authorities. Judge Patricia Crawley, designated as PC-12, had facilitated irregular adoption procedures through her family court. Her correspondence revealed that she had expedited adoptions for network members, ensuring that paperwork was processed with minimal oversight and that background investigations were perfunctory at best. She had also apparently suppressed investigations into missing children cases that might have revealed connections between the disappearances and network activities. The most disturbing correspondent was someone identified only as the coordinator, whose letters bore no return address and were signed only with the symbol of an inverted triangle containing the number 1. These letters served as administrative communications for the network, coordinating what were referred to as gatherings and establishing protocols for information sharing and mutual protection. One such letter, dated 1979, outlined plans for what was called the Regional Convergence, to be held at a location referred to only as the Sanctuary. The letter indicated that network members were expected to bring contributions to the gathering, and that these contributions would be evaluated by the Council for their suitability for various purposes. The clinical language could not disguise the horrifying implication that children were being traded between network members like commodities. The convergence location was eventually identified through property records as a remote compound in the Appalachian Mountains, approximately 200 miles from the Ashford Mansion. The property had been purchased in 1961 by a corporation whose board of directors included several names that appeared in Theodore's correspondence. Satellite imagery revealed a cluster of buildings arranged around a central structure, with access roads that had been designed to minimize visibility from public highways. Further investigation revealed that similar properties existed in at least 6 other states, all owned by variations of the same corporate structure, all located in remote areas with minimal local law enforcement presence. The coordination required to establish and maintain such a network suggested resources and planning that went far beyond the capabilities of individual predators acting independently. But the network's most insidious aspect was its integration into legitimate institutions. The correspondence revealed that network members had deliberately sought positions of authority and trust within the systems designed to protect children. Foster care agencies, family courts, child psychology practices, and educational institutions had been systematically infiltrated by individuals who used their positions to identify and acquire victims while suppressing investigations that might reveal their activities. A letter from 1983, signed by someone identified as RH-15, discussed the successful placement of network members in key positions within 3 state child protective services agencies. The letter noted that these placements had resulted in improved acquisition rates and enhanced security protocols that had effectively eliminated the risk of outside interference in network activities. The scope of the conspiracy became even more apparent when I discovered financial records hidden behind a false wall in Theodore's study. These documents revealed a sophisticated funding mechanism that had supported network operations for decades. Wealthy members contributed to what was described as the foundation, which then provided resources for property acquisition, legal expenses, and what were euphemistically termed operational requirements. The Foundation's financial records showed expenditures for bribes to law enforcement officials, payments to corrupt adoption agencies, and regular transfers to accounts associated with the remote properties where the network conducted its activities. The total amount of money involved suggested that the network's operations had been funded at a level that ensured their continued success and expansion. Perhaps most disturbing of all was evidence that the network had been systematically documenting its activities for purposes that went beyond mere record-keeping. Hidden among Theodore's files were hundreds of photographs, videotapes, and written accounts that appeared to have been shared among network members. The existence of this material suggested that the abuse of children was not merely a means to an end, but an end in itself, with network members taking sadistic pleasure in documenting and sharing their crimes. One letter from the coordinator outlined plans for what was called the Archive Project, which would create permanent repositories for network documentation in multiple locations. The letter indicated that these archives would serve both as blackmail material to ensure member loyalty and as instructional resources for training new members in network methodologies. The realization that such archives existed and that they might contain evidence of hundreds or thousands of victims added another layer of urgency to my investigation. But it also revealed the true scale of what I was confronting. This was not simply a matter of historical crimes that could be reported to authorities. This was evidence of an ongoing conspiracy that had the resources and connections to protect itself from conventional law enforcement. The correspondence contained references to network activities as recent as the late 1980s, only a few years before Theodore's death. While some members had died or retired, others appeared to still be active, and the network's infrastructure remained intact. The implications were staggering. If the network had continued operating after Theodore's death, children were still being abused and murdered while the perpetrators enjoyed the protection of their wealth, connections, and carefully constructed facades of respectability. Standing in Theodore's study, surrounded by evidence of systematic horror that spanned decades in multiple states, I faced a terrible choice. I could report what I had discovered to law enforcement, knowing that many of the perpetrators were likely beyond prosecution due to death or statute of limitations, and that others had the resources and connections to escape justice. Or I could take more direct action, using the network's own documentation to expose and destroy an organization that had operated in secrecy for far too long. As I prepared to leave the Ashford mansion for what I knew would be the final time, I carried with me not just evidence of historical crimes, but proof of an ongoing conspiracy that continued to threaten vulnerable children. The question was no longer what had happened to Elena and the others, but what was still happening to children whose names I would never know, in hidden rooms beneath other respectable facades, while a network of predators continued their work with the confidence that their secrets would remain buried. The weight of that knowledge would determine every decision I made from that moment forward. The final revelation came not from documents or correspondence, but from Elena herself. I had returned to the mansion one last time before contacting authorities, driven by a compulsion I could not fully explain. The house felt different in the days following my discoveries, less oppressive, as though the exposure of its secrets had somehow diminished its power to intimidate and conceal. Yet there remained something unfinished, some crucial piece of the truth that had not yet been revealed. It was in the hidden room beneath the basement, standing among the desperate scratchings Elena had carved into the stone walls, that I finally understood the full scope of what Theodore had believed he was accomplishing. The words carved into the wall were not random expressions of despair, but fragments of something more organized, pieces of Elena's attempt to document what she had witnessed during her 3 years of captivity. By arranging myself at different angles and using a powerful flashlight to cast shadows that revealed the depth of the carvings, I was able to decipher longer passages that had not been immediately apparent. Elena had been systematically recording what she observed, creating a testimony carved in stone that had survived long after her voice had been silenced. "The ceremony happens on the new moon," read one passage carved near the ceiling where it would be least likely to be discovered. "They bring others from far away. The man with the scar talks about the old ways. They say our blood makes them strong." Another passage, carved lower on the wall, provided details that finally explained Theodore's obsession with documentation and ritual. He writes everything down, says his grandfather started it, says the family gets rich when children die. Sarah tried to warn me before they took her. But it was a passage near the door, carved so deeply that it had damaged the mortar between stones, that revealed the most crucial information. The baby is different. He says the baby will replace him. The baby's blood is special because it comes from the old family, my mother's family, the Spanish family with the power. Standing in that terrible room, reading Elena's desperate testimony, I finally understood not just what had happened to her, but why I had been spared. Elena and I were related. The resemblance I had noticed in her photographs was not coincidental. We shared the same bloodline, the same ancestry that Theodore had believed carried special significance for his ritualistic practices. The hidden documentation in Theodore's ledger had referenced the bloodline and hereditary obligations, but I had assumed these were merely expressions of his delusional belief system. Elena's testimony revealed that Theodore's obsession with bloodlines was based on a specific ancestry that he believed enhanced the power of his rituals. Elena's mother had apparently been descended from a Spanish family that Theodore associated with what he called the old ways, a combination of Catholic mysticism and indigenous spiritual practices that he had corrupted into his own sadistic interpretation. I had been selected as Theodore's successor not simply because he needed someone to continue his work, but because my biological parents had been chosen specifically for their genetic connection to the same ancestral line that had made Elena valuable to him. The private arrangement through which I had been acquired was not a standard adoption, but a breeding program designed to produce children who Theodore believed carried the spiritual power necessary for his rituals to be effective. This revelation cast my entire childhood in a new light. The love and attention I had received from Theodore and Margaret had not been genuine parental affection, but careful cultivation of a successor who would eventually inherit both their wealth and their horrific practices. Every kindness had been calculated, every expression of love designed to ensure my loyalty to the family that had raised me. But Elena's testimony revealed something that Theodore had not anticipated. The very bloodline he had sought to exploit had also given her the strength to resist him for 3 years, to document his crimes, and to leave a record that would eventually expose the truth. The special power he had attributed to our ancestry was not supernatural enhancement of his rituals, but the resilience and determination that had allowed Elena to survive far longer than any of his previous victims. Her final carved message, barely legible and positioned where she must have known it would be the last thing she would ever write, consisted of a single word repeated 7 times: remember. Standing in that hidden room, surrounded by Elena's desperate testimony, I understood that she had somehow known that someone would eventually discover her words. She had carved her story into stone, not just as an expression of despair, but as a message for whoever would eventually uncover the truth about the Ashford mansion and its terrible secrets. The supernatural elements that had always permeated the house, the sense of being watched, the cold spots, the way certain rooms felt heavy with unspoken presence, were not manifestations of Elena's spirit but evidence of the trauma that had soaked into the very foundations of the building. The house itself had become a repository of suffering, a place where so much pain had been inflicted that it had left an indelible mark on the physical structure. But understanding Elena's message also revealed the true scope of Theodore's delusion. He had believed that the systematic torture and murder of children would somehow transfer their life force to him, ensuring his family's continued prosperity and power. The elaborate rituals, the careful documentation, the obsessive attention to bloodlines, all of it had been based on a fundamentally insane belief that human sacrifice could manipulate supernatural forces. Yet in a perverse way, Theodore's beliefs had become self-fulfilling prophecies. The Ashford family had indeed prospered, but not because of supernatural intervention. Their wealth had come from their connections to the network of like-minded predators who had supported each other's activities while collectively accumulating resources and influence. The power Theodore had sought through ritual had actually been derived from the systematic corruption of institutions designed to protect children. Elena's testimony also revealed details about the ceremonies that had been conducted at the remote properties I had identified through the correspondence. She had been forced to participate in preliminary rituals, transported to the sanctuary, where network members gathered to share victims and conduct their twisted ceremonies. Her descriptions of these events, carved in fragments across the stone walls, painted a picture of organized sadism that had masqueraded as spiritual practice. "They wear robes and masks," read one passage. "The old man reads from a book in Spanish. They say the words give them power over life and death. They are wrong. They are just evil men who hurt children." The ceremonies Elena described bore the hallmarks of occult ritual, but were clearly corrupted versions of legitimate spiritual practices. Theodore and his associates had appropriated elements from various traditions: Catholic mysticism, indigenous American spirituality, European folk magic, and twisted them into justifications for their crimes. The elaborate symbolism and ritual language had served to create a sense of higher purpose that allowed the perpetrators to rationalize their actions as something more significant than simple sadism. But Elena's most important testimony concerned the network's plans for expansion and continuation. She had overheard conversations about establishing new properties, recruiting additional members, and developing what Theodore called the second generation. Children like me who would be raised within the network and trained to carry on its activities. He talks about making more like him, Elena had carved. Says the work must continue after he dies. Says the baby will have children who will have children. Says the bloodline will make the power stronger. This revelation explained not just my own survival, but the network's long-term strategy. They had not been content to operate as a single generation of predators. They had been systematically creating a multi-generational conspiracy that would outlast any individual member. Children like me were being prepared to inherit not just property and wealth, but active participation in organized child abuse. The implications were staggering. If the network had successfully raised even a few children to adulthood with the intention of continuing their practices, the conspiracy could have expanded exponentially. Each new generation would have been more sophisticated, better funded, and more deeply embedded in legitimate institutions than the last. As I prepared to leave Elena's prison for the final time, I understood that my investigation had revealed not just historical crimes, but an ongoing threat that extended far beyond the Ashford mansion. The network that had killed Elena and so many others had been designed to survive and expand, and there was no guarantee that Theodore's death had ended their activities. Elena's final message, remember, had been intended not just as a record of what had happened to her, but as a charge to whoever discovered her testimony. She had understood that exposure of the truth would require more than simply documenting the crimes. It would require ensuring that the network could never operate with impunity again. Standing in that hidden room, reading the desperate words she had carved into stone during 3 years of captivity, I made the same commitment Elena had made, to remember, to document, and to ensure that the truth could never again be buried beneath facades of respectability and carefully constructed silence. The question that remained was not whether to act, but how to act in a way that would honor Elena's memory while ensuring that no other child would suffer as she had suffered. The decision to contact law enforcement proved to be both necessary and inadequate. Detective Sarah Martinez of the State Police Major Crimes Unit listened to my account with the professional skepticism that such extraordinary claims deserved. But the physical evidence I presented, the photographs, the ledger, the hidden rooms, the correspondence, gradually convinced her that I was documenting actual crimes rather than elaborate fiction. The investigation that followed consumed nearly 2 years and involved multiple agencies across 6 states. The remote properties identified through Theodore's correspondence were searched, revealing additional evidence of the network's activities: makeshift crematoriums that had been used to dispose of remains, underground chambers similar to the ones I had discovered beneath the Ashford mansion, and archives containing thousands of photographs and documents that confirmed the scope of the conspiracy. But the challenges of prosecuting crimes that had occurred decades earlier, perpetrated by individuals who were now dead or beyond the reach of conventional justice, became apparent almost immediately. Of the 23 network members identified through the correspondence, 11 had died of natural causes, 7 were suffering from dementia so severe that they were incompetent to stand trial, and 3 had apparently fled the country years earlier when they sensed that law enforcement interest in their activities was increasing. Only 2 individuals were ultimately brought to trial: Dr. Marcus Whitmore, whose medical license had been suspended following the discovery of irregular patient records, and Judge Patricia Crawley, who had taken early retirement but was still mentally competent to face charges. Both were convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy and accessory to murder, but their advanced age meant that their sentences, 12 and 15 years respectively, were likely to be served in medical facilities rather than traditional prisons. The investigation did succeed in identifying 17 additional victims whose remains were recovered from the remote properties, allowing their families to finally have answers about disappearances that had haunted them for decades. But for every victim we identified, the evidence suggested there were others whose stories would never be fully known. Children whose names had been deliberately erased from all records and whose remains had been destroyed so thoroughly that no trace remained. Perhaps more disturbing was the evidence that suggested the network's activities had not ended with Theodore's death. The most recent correspondence found in the archives was dated 1994, only 2 years before Theodore died, and contained references to new acquisitions and enhanced security protocols that suggested ongoing operations. While no evidence was found of activities after the late 1990s, the investigation could not definitively establish that the network had been completely dismantled. The institutional failures revealed by the investigation were as significant as the individual crimes. Child Protective Services agencies in 3 states had to acknowledge that their systems had been systematically compromised by network members, leading to policy changes and enhanced background investigations for personnel in sensitive positions. The private adoption agency that had facilitated my own placement and the acquisitions of several other victims was found to have operated with virtually no oversight for decades, its record so incomplete and irregular that determining the full scope of its involvement in the network's activities proved impossible. But the investigation also revealed the resilience of institutional indifference. Despite the evidence of systematic corruption, many agencies resisted implementing the comprehensive reforms that would have been necessary to prevent similar infiltration in the future. Budget constraints, bureaucratic inertia, and what Detective Martinez described as a collective unwillingness to acknowledge the true scope of the problem limited the practical impact of our discoveries. The Ashford mansion became the center of extensive forensic investigation, with teams spending months documenting every aspect of the hidden rooms and analyzing physical evidence that had been preserved by the cool, dry conditions of the basement. Elena's carved testimony was photographed, transcribed, and entered into evidence, finally giving her the voice she had been denied during her captivity. The house itself posed a unique challenge. As the legal heir to the Ashford estate, I had the authority to dispose of the property, but the mansion had also become a crime scene of historical significance. After consultation with victim advocacy groups and the families of identified victims, I decided to donate the property to a foundation that would preserve it as a memorial and research center focused on institutional child abuse. The mansion now serves as headquarters for the Elena Castellano Center for Child Protection, a research and advocacy organization that works to identify and prevent the systematic exploitation of vulnerable children. The hidden rooms have been preserved exactly as they were found, serving as stark reminders of what can happen when predators are allowed to operate with impunity behind facades of respectability. But the most significant outcome of the investigation was not legal or institutional, but personal. In the process of documenting the network's crimes, I had connected with other survivors, adults who had escaped similar situations, families who had never learned what happened to missing children, and professionals who had dedicated their careers to protecting vulnerable populations. Among these connections was Maria Castellanos, Elena's aunt, who had never stopped searching for her niece despite decades of official indifference to her inquiries. Maria had maintained Elena's memory through traditional Mexican Day of the Dead observances, creating altars and leaving offerings for a child she had never been allowed to properly mourn. When I contacted her to share what I had learned about Elena's fate, she responded with a mixture of grief and gratitude that remains one of the most profound conversations of my life. Elena was always strong, Maria told me during our first meeting. Even as a little girl, she had this determination, this refusal to accept injustice. I used to worry that the world would break her spirit, but now I understand that she never let them break her. She kept fighting, even when fighting seemed impossible. Through Maria, I learned about Elena's early life, her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love of drawing and storytelling. The child who had seemed like a mysterious figure in Theodore's photographs became a real person with hopes and aspirations that had been cut short by systematic evil. But Maria also shared stories that revealed Elena's character, her loyalty to friends, her protection of younger children, her instinctive distrust of adults who seemed too eager to help. She had good instincts about people, Maria said. If she had been older when her mother died, if she had not been so desperate for someone to care about her, she would never have trusted the people who took her. But she was just a child, and children want to believe that adults will protect them. The memorial service we held for Elena and the other identified victims was attended by hundreds of people, family members, law enforcement officers, victim advocates, and community members who had been deeply affected by the revelations about the network's activities. But perhaps the most meaningful moment occurred when Maria presented me with a photograph of Elena that had not been in Theodore's collection, a picture taken shortly before her mother's death, showing Elena laughing at something outside the camera's view. "This is how I want her to be remembered," Maria said, "not as a victim, but as a child who had joy in her life, who believed in goodness even when goodness failed her." Standing in the cemetery, where Elena's remains had finally been laid to rest beside a proper headstone bearing her full name and dates of birth and death, I understood that the investigation had provided something more valuable than legal justice. It had restored dignity to victims who had been treated as disposable objects, had given families the answers they had sought for decades, and had created a permanent record that would ensure their stories could never again be buried beneath institutional silence. But questions remain that may never be answered. The network's archives contained references to activities in other countries, suggesting international connections that were never fully investigated. Financial records indicated resources that exceeded what could be accounted for through identified members' contributions, implying additional funding sources that were never discovered. And most disturbing of all, demographic analysis of missing children reports suggests patterns that extend beyond the time frame and geographic scope of the network we documented. The possibility that similar networks continue to operate, that children are still being systematically exploited by organized groups of predators, remains a source of ongoing concern for law enforcement and child protection professionals. The methods developed by Theodore's network, the infiltration of legitimate institutions, the careful selection of vulnerable victims, the systematic destruction of evidence, represent a template that could be replicated by other groups with similar inclinations. As I write this account, 15 years after discovering Elena's first photograph in Theodore's desk, I am struck by how the investigation changed not just my understanding of my own history, but my perspective on the nature of evil itself. The network that killed Elena and so many others was not composed of monsters who were obviously different from normal people. It was made up of individuals who maintained facades of respectability while participating in systematic atrocities. This realization has implications that extend far beyond the specific crimes we documented. It suggests that our institutions, our communities, and our families may harbor individuals whose public personas mask private participation in activities we prefer not to acknowledge. The challenge is not simply identifying such individuals after their crimes have been committed, but developing systems that can detect and prevent organized exploitation before it claims additional victims. Elena's message, carved desperately into stone during 3 years of captivity, continues to resonate. Remember, not just the specific details of what happened to her and the others, but the broader lessons about vulnerability, institutional failure, and the responsibility we all share for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Ashford Mansion stands empty now, its rooms open to researchers and advocates who study the intersection of privilege and predation. The hidden chambers beneath the basement serve as stark reminders of what can happen when evil is allowed to operate behind closed doors, protected by wealth and respectability, and the collective reluctance to believe that such horrors are possible. But the mansion also stands as a testament to the power of truth to eventually overcome even the most carefully constructed silence. Elena's voice, silenced for decades, finally found expression through the words she carved in stone and the investigation her testimony inspired. Her refusal to be forgotten ultimately led to the exposure of crimes that had been buried for generations. In the end, perhaps that is Elena's true legacy, not the circumstances of her death, but the persistence of her determination to ensure that the truth would eventually be known. In a world where vulnerable children continue to face exploitation and abuse, her example reminds us that bearing witness, documenting truth, and refusing to accept institutional indifference remain our most powerful tools for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The investigation is closed, but the work continues. Every child who grows up safe from systematic exploitation, every predator who is prevented from operating with impunity, every institution that prioritizes protection over reputation represents a small victory in Elena's name. Her story ends not with her death in that hidden room beneath the Ashford mansion, but with the knowledge that her courage in the face of unimaginable horror ultimately led to changes that will protect other children from suffering the same fate. In refusing to be forgotten, she ensured that her life would have meaning beyond the circumstances of its ending. The house remembers. The records remain. And Elena's voice, carved in stone and preserved in testimony, continues to bear witness to both the capacity for evil and the possibility of justice in a world that too often fails its most vulnerable members.